Well, I think there's too much talk about intuitions in philosophy, and it has a rather mystifying effect, as though we had some special faculty of intuition that gave us direct insight into philosophical reality or something of that kind. In my view, there's no special phenomenon of intuition. The things that are called intuitions are judgments or beliefs of one kind and another, one kind or another. And so asking why we're using intuitions in philosophy is like asking why we use judgments in philosophy. And I mean, the answer is, well, you can't do any kind of inquiry without making some judgments. And so I think it's a kind of non-problem, really, about reliance on intuition, because, of course, we have to make judgments, and so in a sense we have to rely on our judgments, but that applies just as much to scientists and historians and others as it does to philosophers. I mean, we can perhaps narrow down the question a little bit by focusing on judgments which are not the conclusion of some process of inference, but are just direct judgments. As we say, non-inferential judgments. There may be judgments that are made using quite ordinary, maybe vague terms, and they're judgments typically that in philosophy that are not made on the basis of direct perceptual evidence. But of course, even in those cases, there are all sorts of judgments which pretty much everybody would accept. I mean, so for example, even the most strident critics of intuition are perfectly happy to make judgments such as that the evidence for the theory of evolution is better than the evidence for the theory of creation, and they're willing to make judgments such as that you shouldn't accept a theory if there's no evidence for it, and so on. And really, those you could call those judgments intuitions if you wanted to, but it doesn't really help us to understand what's going on when we make such judgments. But one thing is clear, that any kind of theoretical inquiry that we go in for will have to involve the making of some such judgments. I mean, of course, in some cases we can make judgments that are based on a long line of argument, but the argument has to start somewhere. So everybody is going to have to make some judgments which are not inferred, and which, if you wanted to, you could call an intuition. Okay. Well, I'd like to divide that into a number of issues. One issue is about what philosophy can contribute to society. And I think there are lots of examples which show that philosophy has an enormous contribution to make to wider society. I mean, one coming from the area of logic that I work on is that the very idea of a computer emerged from investigations into the foundations of mathematics that were being conducted jointly by philosophers and mathematicians, and so the idea of a computer was first formulated in the 1930s before anybody had actually built a computer in the full modern sense. So, I mean, that's something which has completely revolutionized society and which whose origins come, at least in part, from philosophy. Another example would be, if one takes political philosophy, an extremely influential book has been John Rawls's theory of justice, and a question which politicians in all societies have to grapple with is what is the basis of the legitimacy of the state, and how far can it interfere in private lives? How much? What kind of role can it play in redistributing goods or in applying principles of justice? And it's clear that those are philosophical questions. And yet another example is that in arguments for and against the existence of God. I mean, those are arguments which matter a lot to very many people, and that those are issues which have been debated for a long time in philosophy, and I think it's philosophy which has developed the most critical understanding of what kind of structure an argument needs to have in order to be valid. So I don't think there's any doubt that philosophy has a major contribution to society. Now, a different question is what role philosophers themselves have to play in that. And I mean, I think some people imagine that that philosophers somehow should all be public intellectuals who are appearing on television to directly apply their ideas to specific issues in contemporary society. And of course, I don't think there's anything illegitimate about a philosopher doing that, but I think it's a great mistake to suppose that there's any special obligation on philosophers to do that, more than there is on people who practice any other intellectual discipline. I mean, historians, biologists, all sorts of people have huge contributions to make to society. But it doesn't mean that every historian should be a public intellectual or that every biologist should be a public intellectual. I mean, very often the kind of contribution which those subjects can make has to be mediated through several layers of what one can call, in a good sense, popularization. That's to say that the original abstract theories are typically formulated in a way which makes them hard to apply to practical problems, and so in a way they need to be reprocessed in a way that makes their practical applications clearer. And I mean, some things are gained and some things are lost in that process. But I mean, for example, all sorts of subtleties in the formulation of the theory may have to be put aside because it's just not practical to take account of them. On the other hand, we get something which has clearer practical implications. And it's not necessarily the case that the people who come up with the original theories are the people who are best placed to extract practical applications from them in a way that's accessible to the people who actually have to make those applications. So that I think there's space for people playing an intermediary role between between philosophy and as it were, its practical applications. Well, I guess the ontological costs are supposed to be in the multiplication of entities that the theory postulates. I mean, in my view, ontological costs are just one form of theoretical cost, and the mere multiplication of entities by itself is not, it seems to me, particularly problematic. If some theory in physics postulates infinitely many subatomic particles, that's completely fine, provided that the theoretical benefits are large enough. I think that the real costs are not so much in the multiplication of entities as in the complication of the theory, and so that, I mean, for example, in the case of Lewis's theory of possible worlds, the problem is not simply that he's postulating that there are infinitely many space-time systems that are disconnected from our own, but that he's making all sorts of ad hoc assumptions about the relation between those alleged spatiotemporal systems and questions about what could have been different and what could not have been otherwise. And it seems to me that it's the messiness and implausibility of the apparatus that he needs in order to connect his worlds with questions of possibility and necessity that's a far more worrying feature of his theory.